good, everyone? This is not so great slot, right? I'm in between your lunch and otherwise. So, but I'll kind of keep it crisp. As she said, AI is everywhere. I sometimes dream about AI. If you think about it, a couple of years ago, since we have this UI in front of AI, we have seen like exponential growth, right? A quick show of hands before we get started. How many of you are experimenting with 2 or more models across your startups? Awesome. How many of you have rolled out in production? All right. So what we will talk about today is not about the models, right? So one thing I realize is the space is so rapid that there's new technology updates and models coming out every single week. What we'll try to understand, though, is what's driving this platform shift? What fundamental features do we need to understand? How do you, as startups, learn from organizations in terms of how to drive impact? What are the common mistakes to avoid? Top use cases and how they are going to evolve? And most importantly, where is this going to head? What are the themes that we see looking ahead now and into the future? So let me start with understanding what are those underlying laws which shape this platform shift, right? I run this podcast on Generative AI, and I call this the iPhone moment. Much like cloud, much like mobile, we are at the cusp of another platform shift. One of the core things which we have been speaking about is Moore's Law, right? If you'll have heard about how performance doubles every 18 months. Now with AI, that's accelerated. Performance doubles almost every 6 months. We see improvement every 6 months. Now, what's interesting though is it's not just that, right? We see that in inference compute as well. Now, which means that it allows us to solve harder problems. I just want to take a minute to unpack that, right? So if you think about O1, how many of you have followed the new O1 model release? Yeah. So what's the difference? What's the difference in terms of what LLMs were offering versus O1? Think about it in terms of system 1 versus system 2 thinking, if any of you have read that book, right? So system 1 thinking is you ask a question, what's the capital of India? You get New Delhi. You get immediate impulsive responses, right? A lot of times, that's great, right? We as humans do that as well. A lot of times, that's not necessarily sufficient when you're trying to solve complex problems. You need to think. Say you're solving a very complex physics problem, astrophysics problem. You need to think through things, right? That takes inference. You need to think through inference. And that's the system 2 thinking, right? And that's where the O1 model moved towards. And that's why that is disruptive. So what's kind of driving this together, right? There are 3 capabilities I want you to understand, which is coming together to drive this breakthrough. The first one is this universal interface. Now, this universal interface, which is multimodal, which means it accepts images, it accepts speech and video, both as input and output, right? So you're conversing in a language you and I understand. The second one is the reasoning and planning capabilities. Think of this like as neural algebra, right? Which allows you to solve complex problems by detecting patterns and making predictions. So that's a second part of the capability. And then, most importantly, we also have memory and context, right? We have a rich context and we are able to teach the models and tell them how to use the tools. Now, all of these breakthroughs coming together is what's driving AI to get exponentially better. What does this lead to? When we put all of this together, we build a rich agentic world. And I'll talk a bit more about agents, right? In terms of how we are moving towards a world of agents. And this is agents that can act on our behalf across work, across life, across teams, business processes, and across organizations, right? How do we bring that all together? So we spoke about the platform shift. We spoke about what is causing this. So kind of moving on from there, let's bring it back to what does it mean in reality, right? Like what do you see as top patterns? And we'll come to the use cases in a bit. Let's talk about the patterns, right? A lot of you as startups probably are exploring and could explore one of these. It's not exhaustive, but this is something which we see as VNext patterns. Voice, let's start with SLM fine-tuning, right? So Anyone experimenting with small language models? All right, so as a quick context, if 2023 was the year of large language models, 2024, I would say, is the year of small language models. And there are multiple of them, right, including our 5 series. Now, think of that in terms of like training it not just on the whole corpus of data, but on textbook information. So it's very specific, it's very, for a particular topic, right? It's not general purpose, it's very specific to a specific purpose. And that's okay, right? Not everything requires a LLM. And this is, think of it, because it has smaller tokens, it's more cost effective as well. A lot of them spoke about, and when we talk about AI, right, especially as startups, cost is a huge concern. So we see a lot of SLM fine-tuning use cases which happens, especially in scenarios where cost is important, right? Or where you need very specific information. Like, for example, think about medical domain, where there's a lot of jargon, where there's a lot of information which is unique to that domain, where you could, or you need to fine-tune. And there's also a lot of other areas where organizations which are doing cutting-edge work are using SLMs very effectively. And I'll give you specific examples to make this real, right? So we were talking to this organizations, they're trying to build out, say, voice bots, right? And we'll talk about voice bots in a bit. What happens is when you're putting it in front of an interface, you're putting it in front of a customer, you want to make sure that it handles, so a customer's coming in, it could be, say, e-commerce. Customer comes in, they're taking these questions, they're trying to browse through and look at shop for something, for example, right? Now, that's a great thing, ideal experience. You want them to navigate through, get the requirements, search through it, get to the page, finish, and go through the customer journey. You also, at the same time, want to guardrail it, right? Because you don't want, because all of this costs, all of this is tokens, which means it has associated costs. So something like putting SLM at the beginning of it could allow you to classify which of these intents the customer comes. Like, say I come in and I'm not like browsing for skirts, I'm asking about something which is completely irrelevant, right? You don't want the bot to either answer it or even engage in that, because it, again, is cost. So you could put in an SLM, for example, at that layer itself, right? So there are multiple very unique ways in which organizations can leverage SLM, and it is definitely much cheaper, more easier to kind of implement. So that's a use case I would definitely recommend if you're looking at trying it out. The second thing I want to talk about is the voice bots, right? Think about it, how many of times we call these, so say I have an issue with my banking, or I have an issue with my delivery, right? We tend to want to call people and figure it out. We don't want to like just chat, right? Voice is very effective when used well. But the challenge also is that when we call, you go through those IVRs, right? Like by the time you get through a person, you're just so frustrated, you just drop the call. I'm like, I don't want to do this anymore. But think about how it would be if you were to have a real voice capability, which is almost human-like, right? Which allows you to interrupt, it is colloquial, it can differentiate between my voice versus another person's voice, it is interruptible, it differentiates between noise and voice. All of that capability is integrated. Now, there's huge amounts of improvements which has happened over here. We had a real-time voice capability launched recently, and we are seeing a lot of adoption in this space. Think call center, right? Again, call center analytics is a huge space altogether, but if you even think about any kind of outbound or inbound voice use cases, it could be support, it could be cross-sell, upsell, marketing, any kind of use cases, right? It brings in a huge amount of efficiency in terms of cost. It handles peak workloads. So for example, say you're running like one of these e-commerce firms which runs a sale during Diwali, right? You don't want to bring in more resources for that period of time. It addresses those peak workloads. It makes sure that your quality is consistent. It's scalable. So the way, that's another area where we absolutely see scaling which is happening. The other thing I want to call out is how our company is going beyond traditional RAG. How many of you have tried out RAG? Retrieval Augmented Generation, yeah? I think every single company who's stepping into generative AI has probably explored RAG, right? What is happening now, though, is how do you go beyond the traditional RAG? See, think about it, right? If you just take a step back and look at how we progressed in terms of search. The first time when we used to work on NLP, natural language processing, much like 2018, 19, having a keyword-based search was what was there, right? And it is a very noisy, like when you're working with text data, it's very noisy. You tend to have a lot of, error rate is much high. And then from there you come to semantic, right? Which is you're identifying through intent, right? If I say a word, you're not just taking that word and searching for it. You're identifying what is that word. So if I say bank, is it bank as a river bank, or is it bank as a financial institution, right? That is how you improve relevance. Now, we had a bunch of announcements around the search last week, including query rewriting, which means when a customer searches for something, can you rewrite that query in multiple ways in which the customer could search, right? Because when you rewrite it in multiple ways, it improves the relevance. So there's a huge amount of advancements happening in terms of how search and traditional RAG is evolving. And finally, one of my favorite topics of all, agents, right? I know a lot of them confuse bots with agents. Agents, by definition, is agency to do things, right? So how do you enable AI to act on your behalf? How do you enable it to orchestrate multiple tasks and take actions? And let's kind of talk about this. I think it's important to talk about how agents are evolving, because we see that as an area which will definitely disrupt in the near future. So I want to give you some examples of this, right? Let's take single LLMs first. So this is what we started with, right? Like a couple of years ago when we had ChatGPT. If you ask a question, you get a response, right? You ask what's the height, and you get a response. The challenges, though, are you have hallucinations. Sometimes reasoning becomes a challenge. So then for it to become a bit more effective and be enterprise ready, you add tools to it. So it becomes a single agent, LLMs plus tools. So for example, you could give access to the knowledge bases. So you're not just answering from what it was in 2021, you're answering based on what you know now, right? You also give it access to other tools. Like for example, say I want to plot something. You can give it access to something like a code interpreter. Therefore, it allows you to give you the response, which is more grounded in that sense. But what it is moving towards, because tasks are complex, right? What it's moving towards is towards the multi-agent ecosystem. So think of multi-agents as any areas where there's multiple tasks, and that's how we are, right? Like think about a use case where, say we need to onboard 5 employees by Monday. The number of things which needs to happen for that to happen, right? You need the HR to coordinate, you need the IT department, the procurement department, the admin department, all of them to kind of coordinate, come together. The hiring manager will have to be there. So how do you create these different agents? How do you orchestrate the flow between them? How do you have a master agent or a persona who's kind of directing, do these tasks and kind of do this, right? And then of course, how do you have a human in a loop if required in order to make sure that we are going through this through the guardrails, right? That's where we are evolving. And finally, one thing I just want to touch upon is it's definitely different from RPA, right? That's the other question I get. Is it similar to traditionally used bots? It's not, because this brings in context learning. So you're taking decisions based on what you know, right? So that's how it is different. Clearly, I'm super passionate about agents, but with that, let's move on to the strategy impact. See, we spoke a lot about the platform. Let's talk about what drives impact, and more importantly, what are the challenges in not getting there, right? See, the first thing, we have this thing, right? Like security is our #1 job. We talk about that a lot. There is this pervasive myth, right, that responsible AI is like a hindrance, it's a barrier to AI adoption. There can be nothing further away from the truth, because what you would realize is if there's a responsible AI approach, it actually fosters AI innovation, right? Because then you're grounding it to what the organizational standards are, what the societal expectations are, and then it allows you to sustainably grow your organizations. And that's what you see, that's what the numbers show, right? So that is the first one, security, responsible AI principles. The other thing I want to talk about is, especially with startups, I mentor a lot of startups, and sometimes one theme I see is this hammer and search of a nail problem, right? Like I want to use AI, let's go and find a problem. that usually doesn't fly because then you're building out these thin wrappers, then you don't have a core value prop, right? And that's the areas which gets disrupted. So problem first, tech second, right? And this is not an exhaustive list, but this is a framework about how you can think about top use cases. Again, with the problem first approach, if you think about it, any of your use cases, okay? Broadly, it'll fall under one of those 4 categories. And just talk about the categories, then I'll talk about how it is evolving. You're either increasing your productivity, improving efficiency, you're automating processes, you're improving customer experience, or you're driving innovation or creativity, right? It falls under one of those 4. And these patterns which you see under it, again, has evolved over time, right? So for example, virtual agents, a lot of times we started with internal-facing HR bots. For example, can you talk to a bot and get responses based on content or knowledge base which is available about, say, employee vacation policy. I want to understand what's the employee vacation policy. Things like that, right? The low-hanging fruits. It's evolved a lot to multi-agent systems. So a lot of work happening there. Document processing, invoice processing. We have agents which do invoice processing end-to-end almost, right? A lot of work happening in terms of fraud detection. Customer experience was one of the areas which started first, right? Call center analytics, intelligent call center, huge amounts of improvement and exponential growth over there. And my most favorite one is around innovation, right? Especially e-commerce, there's a lot of work and use cases we see in terms of, for example, virtual try-ons, dynamic ad creation, things like that, right? Personalized content. So what is important though is when you do all of this, you're doing it to generate new revenue streams, differentiated customer experiences, or modernizing internal processes. What I want to take away, what I want startups as you to take away from this is have your problem first and then bring in your tech, because the value comes from the scaffolding, value comes from the end-to-end workflow, not necessarily from the model in itself. That comes to the last part of this section, which is, okay, all of this is great, but tell me one thing, Ranjani, we have all of these new models coming up all the time. What should I choose? Should I go to open source? Should I go to frontier models, small long models? How do I choose, right? Now, again, it depends a lot. That's why you start with the problem statement. It depends a lot on the use case which you have. So depending on your needs, you may want to define your specific type of model. This is just a broad set of guidelines. What are the tasks you want to accomplish? You know, some of them can be done with a general purpose model. Some of them may need fine tuning. Some of them could do with SLM. It depends on that. It depends on the inference speed, right? Is it real time? Is it batch? So you have use cases where you need to give real time and customer using use cases. You can have use cases which is batched, which is you're doing it not necessarily in real time, right? Depends on that. And of course, cost, right? That is a huge factor. So keep some broad guidelines in terms of how you're choosing, not necessarily because of the latest benchmarks alone. Okay? With that, I'll wrap up with my last section, which is what's the view looking ahead. This is from one of those recent reports. It talks about the potential, right? 2 trillion incremental cumulative revenue opportunity by 2030. A lot of time there are these questions in terms of, is the impact real? There are companies which are seeing real impact right now, and it's set to scale, right? Like I said, it's another pivotal shift similar to AI, similar to mobile and cloud. What is also interesting is how organizations are experimenting. Much like most of you who raised your hands, many organizations are experimenting with more than one model. It's no longer just 1 or 2, right? They're experimenting with multiple models, both open and closed. What we also do see, and this is from one of the researchers, that a lot of projects do fail. There are multiple reasons, and I can probably talk 1 hour about it. But there are reasons as to why they fail. A large part of it is also because of the complexity, right? Because it's not just about the model, it's about the entire workflow, from the logging to the security to the configuration, all of which matters, and AI should enhance it, not necessarily disrupt it, right? And over the last couple of years, there's been an explosion of tools, models, application. And this is across the life cycle. This is like from one of the reports. And it's just astounding, right? Just if you look at it, the amount of players which you have from code to cloud to governance, which means that where the sector, at least the large organizations will move, is towards not just having a flexible stack, but moving the applications itself or changing the applications itself from like single models to orchestrated systems which can learn and adapt continuously, right? That transition is what's happening right now. What is the other thing I want to call out is, I found this very interesting, right? If you've read, there's this really nice article from not a long time, a few years ago, on A16Z called Software is Eating the World. You know, this report speaks about how that's moving towards services as software. I'll just unpack that a bit, right? If you think about it, do customers need a CRM tool or do they need better customer experience, right? So we need outcome. So customers need outcome. So how do you use AI to provide that outcome as a software, service as a software? I think that's a very early, I found that quite insightful in terms of how they have picked this up. This is from one of the VC reports, right? So that's a very niche trend, but something for you to think about as you build your products, right? In terms of delivering outcomes, not necessarily a specific slice of what the customer is looking at. And finally, to close, what I do want to call out is what I am excited about. The future of AI, I truly believe, is agentic, right? And it doesn't seem to stay there, but here's the thing, right? I don't think, there's this question I get often in terms of, you know, will AI replace us, right? I think of jobs as a set of tasks, right? Not necessarily one stagnant thing. There will be tasks which, of course, get automated. The question, therefore, for us to ask is, what parts of my job are automatable, right? And truly, technology inherently isn't good or bad. It depends on how we use it, right? So truly, the way I think about a future is where AI and humans augment each other and drive value through combined, as they say, co-pilot efforts, right? With that, thanks a lot for your time. A lot of stuff in the short time, but thank you. I'll catch up with you guys if you have any further questions. Thanks, folks.